The Gospel of Mark.
Hello, I'm Larry Smith. I'm the interim pastor at First Christian Church of Fort Thomas, Kentucky, and we bring this community Bible study to you via YouTube so that you can join with us as we study through the Gospel of Mark. This is our 6th episode, and we'll have several more after this. From episode 5 last week, you may remember that we were discussing a block of material in the Gospel of Mark that was divided into 2 parts. There was the first part that we call round 1, and then after round 1 came round 2. The rounds were identified by the doublets in each of these rounds. Now, doublets, remember, were the very similar stories that are told, but they're different. Lots of similarities, but different. In our study last time, we talked about the feeding of the 5,000. Feeding of the 5,000 is very similar to the feeding of the 4,000. They're doublets. The context of the feedings is different, though. In round 1, the stories and the doublets that we find in part 1, round 1, involve the Jews. In round 2, the stories revolve around Gentiles. So in round 1, you have a focus on Jesus' ministry among the Jews. Round 2, Jesus' ministry among the Gentiles. Well, last week we completed round 1, and today we begin with round 2. Remember, round 2 deals with stories and incidents that occur mainly among the Gentiles. Round 1 was kicked off by a water miracle, Jesus silencing the sea. Remember, Jesus has to be wakened from his sleep in the boat as the disciples fear the storm's going to capsize the boat, and Jesus silences the sea. Here we have Jesus walking on the water, again showing Jesus' superiority, his authority over the forces of nature. The passage begins with that very important concept in Mark. Immediately, there's urgency involved as Mark unfolds this story about Jesus. Jesus goes off to pray, be alone, be close to God, to lift his heart up in prayer. And the disciples take off in the boat, and Jesus later on is passing them as he walks on the water. He calls out to them. Very interestingly, the disciples appear to think that Jesus may be a ghost, not a real live person. But Jesus responds with a statement that's often translated as, "It is I. I'm the one." But if you look at the Greek construction that Mark uses to identify Jesus' words, it's the same construction that we find in the Gospel of John for the very famous "I am" statements. That is a translation of the Greek words ego, from which we get the word ego and egotistical and so forth, referring to I. Eimi. Eimi means I am. And this is the construction that is used in the Greek translation of the Tanakh or the Old Testament when it identifies the personal name of God. This personal name of God is usually translated in the First Testament or the Old Testament as the Lord. But here it is translated as, it is I. I'm the one. It's really me. Okay. The disciples' hearts are hardened and they don't understand what's going on. After Jesus walks on the water here, we have another doublet. Jesus heals many at Gennesaret. There's all sorts of speculation about exactly where Gennesaret is located, but the location is not so important as the contrast with its doublet. Now, different authorities point out two different passages from round one that may well be the foundation here for the doublet. Jesus goes to this town and he's able to heal many people. In chapter 6 of Mark, Jesus goes to his hometown and he's able to heal some people, but not many because they didn't have faith. And so you have Jesus visiting these two towns, and the results are dissimilar. But there's also another passage that may also represent a doublet for this passage in round two, and that is Jesus healing the woman with the hemorrhage. This woman, if you recall that story, reached out from the crowd and clutched the hem of his garment and was healed. Now, in this account, Gentiles are reaching out. Not just one, but lots of Gentiles are just reaching out and touching Jesus' cloak and becoming healed. Okay, so we have these two accounts here that either one or both may represent doublets to this story of this summary of healings that Jesus was able to accomplish in this Gentile community. After talking about Jesus healing the Gentiles, Mark puts a very important block of sermonic materials, if you will. This is the second largest block of teaching material in the book of Mark. You have Jesus in Mark 13 with a very long discourse on the end of time, but here we have Jesus' discourse on what really is defilement. And this is important in the first century context of Judaism because there were very strong prejudices against Gentiles in the Jewish world. It was common for Jews to refer to Gentiles as dogs. And we see that in the following text. But here we have Jesus explaining that it's not one's heritage that defiles one, but it's something that comes from the heart, those motives, those impulses that arise within an individual and drives them to commit various sins. That's what is defiling. He gives some examples here of bad motives, we might at best call them. One of these examples is that a number of Jews, and we don't know how many, may not have been too many, but there were those Jews who disregarded the commandment to honor their fathers and mothers, their parents, by donating property to the temple. What they were doing is sort of like a reverse loan in today's market. They would turn their assets over to the temple and get a yearly stipend, a stipend that would not include enough funds to help their parents out. And so they were, their motives seemed to be good. I mean, giving financial resources to support the temple, that was a good thing to do. But they were doing it out of a bad motive. They didn't want to take care of their parents. And so you have Jesus then emphasizing the importance of one's heart, one's soul, one's spirit, one's selfhood, as a source of true greatness in other passages, but here a source of defilement. As a sort of footnote to this passage, you have verse 19. Verse 19 is one of the more controversial verses in the whole book of Mark. It concludes that with these teachings, Jesus declared all foods clean. In other words, you have the destruction of the Jewish cleanliness laws that we usually sometimes in our society call the kosher laws. Exactly when Christians began to move away from the kosher laws is a subject of tremendous debate among scholars. We see the discussion in 1 Corinthians and in other places in Paul's writings. So we know that it was an issue for a number of years. None of the other canonical Gospels have this statement about Jesus abolishing the food laws. So this makes it a controversial statement that we don't know exactly what and when the food laws were abolished in the Christian community. Seems likely that it evolved in different places at different times, but that's all outside of the Gospel of Mark. After this sermonic material, we have one of my favorite passages in the Gospel of Mark, the story of the Syrophoenician woman. Matthew calls her the Canaanite woman. Luke and John don't discuss her at all, but she's my favorite character. She's Syrophoenician. That is, she comes from Syria, a Phoenician background, and so Syrophoenician, the Phoenicians evolved out of the Canaanite tradition, or a portion of the Canaanite tradition, and hence Matthew uses that term. But the Syrophoenician woman is a parallel, a doublet, with the story of Jairus' daughter. Remember, Jairus came to Jesus and said, "My daughter is sick, come to my house and cure her, please." And Jesus started. And when Jesus got there, the little girl was proclaimed dead, but Jesus brought her back to life and restored her to her family. Well, you have this Syrophoenician woman coming to Jesus and says, "Please help my daughter. She's far away, but she needs your intervention." And Jesus calls her a dog, perhaps not one of Jesus' finest hours, but this woman took that metaphor and turned it around. maybe you're like me that when somebody says something like that to me, I think about the perfect response. 2 days later, she came up with it right away. Even the dogs get the crumbs, the leftovers from the children that fall to the floor. Yeah. She's saying, okay, I'm a dog. I'm a despised Gentile. I'm a Syrophoenician. But all I'm asking for is crumbs, some leftovers, something that the children didn't eat, didn't want. Just leftovers. And Jesus responds, calls her a daughter, and says her daughter is going to be well because of what she said. So you have the healing of this woman's daughter, an event that is basically a long distance healing. We've seen Jesus touching people, and we had the one woman who was touched Jesus' robe, but they were all in immediate contact with Jesus. And here you have a long distance healing. Jesus didn't see the girl, wasn't there to lay his hands on her and bless her, but she is well. Next in our story, we have Jesus heals the deaf, mute, and many others. Jesus heals this person who is deaf, he can't hear, mute, he can't speak. In this account, Jesus uses an Aramaic word, ephphatha, which means be open, and Mark translates that for us because the people he was writing for couldn't understand what the Aramaic meant. Now, this is the first of two such stories in the Gospel of Mark, and so it has a doublet later on in the text, and we'll see that. But Mark, I think, and others think too, utilizes this not only to show Jesus' healing power, but to talk about the symbolic importance of hearing and speaking. There's an interaction in the Gospel of Mark, and that refers back to the call experience of Isaiah in chapter 6 of Isaiah. When we have this beautiful experience, we are told that Isaiah, you're going to preach and they're going to hear, but they're not really going to hear. They're going to see and not really see. They're not really going to understand what you're saying. And so by healing this individual who can't hear or speak, you're symbolically talking about people who can now actually hear and comprehend and really understand what you're talking about, and they can speak their minds. Hearing and speaking, very important. Jesus tells them to tell no one about the cure, but they didn't follow him, they didn't obey, and they went out and told more people. In our last account in round 2 of the doublets, we have Jesus feeds the 4,000. We've already talked about this in comparison with the 5,000. Jesus has compassion on the crowds. The crowds had been there for 3 days without food. That's a lot longer sermon than I've ever sat through. But they were there and they were hungry. They found some loaves and fishes, and Jesus multiplied the bread again and the fishes. Again, he uses that Eucharistic formula, that formula associated with communion. He took the bread, he gave thanks for the bread, he broke the bread, and he gave it to them. So we have this Eucharistic communion liturgy incorporated here into the feeding of the 4,000, just like we did with the feeding of the 5,000. So at this point, our series of doublets ends, but there's some passages that follow which help to interpret, help us understand what was going on. The first of these is the Pharisees seek a sign. A sign here is an act of power. That's sort of the literal meaning of it. Not like a road sign that says stop, go, whatever. But a sign of power. You know, where have they been? You know, Jesus just fed 4,000 folks, had bunches and bunches of food left over from just these meager few fishes and 7 loaves. Where were they? But they want a sign. In Matthew and Luke, when the Pharisees come asking for a sign, Jesus gives them the sign of Jonah. Jonah was in the belly of the great fish for 3 days, and then the fish vomited him up on shore. So this becomes a symbol of the resurrection. But here we don't have that sign, and the implication is you fellows just missed it. Following the Pharisees seek a sign, you have the yeast of the Pharisees. Now, several times in the New Testament when the word yeast is used, it's used as something that's positive. In the making of bread, it's it's a very positive thing. But here it's used in a very negative way. The teachings of the Pharisees are like yeast, and you kind of have to know something about yeast to, I think, get some grasp of what Jesus means here. What yeast does is to create air bubbles in the dough. As it cooks, the air bubbles expand, and you have a light bread that you can cut and so forth. If you try making bread without the right amount of yeast, use too little or not enough, it can be hard as a rock. Break your knife trying to cut it, much less your teeth. But the yeast provides air pockets. In other words, an air pocket is basically nothing. And I think this is at the heart of what Jesus is saying when he talks about the Pharisees' teachings being yeast. They're not really something substantial. Again, Jesus ends this passage with the statement, the question. And remember, Mark uses questions on a number of occasions to help us get our focus, to shape our attention. It's a technique used by lots of teachers and so forth. Do you still not understand? This leads us into a passage which some people have called gaining insight or gaining sight, in which you have the disciples basically learning more and more about who Jesus is and learning more and more about what's expected of them. We begin with the first part of a doublet, and it concludes with the last part of the doublet. The first doublet and the last doublet form the beginning and the end, what scholars sometimes refer to as an inclusio. That is, the material between these two doublets is included for some particular reason into this scheme. And so we have this passage that can be characterized by the notion that the disciples and the readers and listeners to the Gospel of Mark can gain insight into who Jesus is and who the disciples are. Well, the first of these accounts is the healing of the blind man at Bethsaida. And the second part of the doublet here is the healing of the blind Bartimaeus. But the healing of this blind man at Bethsaida is uniquely found in the Gospel of Mark. None of the other Gospels include this miracle. And it's probably not included because it could be interpreted as Jesus not being perhaps all that great a miracle healer. If you remember the story, Jesus takes 2 touches to heal this blind man. Jesus touches him the first time and he says, "Oh, I can see some things, but it's not very clear. I see people, but they look like trees walking around out there." And so Jesus touches the blind man again, and then his sight is restored to perfect. So you have this idea that, this first touch of Jesus could bring about some sight, some insight, but it takes another touch, if you will, for perfect vision to occur. And what we see time and again in this passage is that the disciples see partially the truth, but only partially. There are things that they don't see. And the things that they don't see become teaching opportunities for Jesus to teach more about who he is and what the disciples are. The material in this passage is sort of placed around what are called the 3 passion narratives of Christ. Passion means suffering. It refers in this context to the death of Jesus. And Jesus gives 3 predictions in this passage, and there are other material as well, but 3 passion predictions. Each one of those 3 passion predictions is followed by a question. The disciples don't understand something. And then after the disciples express their questions, or Jesus discovers them, then Jesus teaches them. And what we find is that as we go through the 3 passion predictions, the disciples' questions become more and more precise. They express more and more knowledge, correct knowledge of who Jesus is. to start out after the story of the healing of the blind man, we have the account called Peter's Confession. Functionally, this serves to set a framework, a baseline, if you will, about what the disciples come to this point knowing. Given all the days and weeks and months, however long they've been with Jesus at this point, what do they really know about Jesus? And you have Jesus now turning a question that has been asked before. Who is this, the crowds ask, who has all this teaching authority? The disciples ask, who is this that even the wind and waves obey? Herod simply asks, who is this guy that's disturbing my kingdom? And Jesus now asks his disciples, who am I? Who do people say that I am? Who do you say I am? And the disciples, when they asked, who do people say I am, gave pretty much the same answer that Herod got. And then Jesus asked, who do you say I am? And Peter says, you are the anointed one. You are the Christ. You are the Messiah. Okay. We'll see that Peter got it right, but he didn't fully understand what it meant. It's very interesting that this passage occurs most likely in Gentile area and in the early teachings of the church, particularly as we look in Acts chapter 7 and 8 at Stephen's sermon, where God revealed all sorts of divinely important things to the ancient ancestors in foreign places outside the temple, and how foreign places became significant. Okay. So the disciples start off then with this knowledge that Jesus is the Messiah. Then we go to the first passion prediction. Jesus predicts his death. He does so openly and without any sort of hesitation. And yet, Peter doesn't fully understand, Peter takes Jesus aside in the next sort of little block of material and says, oh, Jesus, you're the Messiah. You can't die. And Jesus says, get thee behind me, Satan. And so you have this account then of Jesus' passion prediction, and then Peter arguing that, no, Jesus, that's not the way this is supposed to work. You're supposed to be the Messiah, and the Messiah is not supposed to die. Jesus uses then this questioning by Peter to talk about the cost of discipleship. What does it mean? What are the implications of being a disciple? What does it mean to follow Christ? And what is it going to cost you? Jesus had, Mark had earlier made some implied statements here when we looked at that intercalation in Mark 6 where the disciples are sent out and they come back, and in the middle you have Herod killing John the Baptist. Ministry can be very dangerous, we learned back then. Here, Jesus is very explicit in teaching about the dangers of following Jesus. Those who save their lives will lose them. Those who lose their lives for Jesus and the gospel shall save their lives. This is what is referred to as the reversal of fortunes. The things that bring positive goods in our society are not things that bring positive good in the kingdom of God. The values of the kingdom of God are different from the values of this world. This reversal of fortunes. As a sort of conclusion in this passage, Jesus says, there are those standing here who shall not die before the kingdom of God comes in power. So, what does that mean? The kingdom of God will come in power, and whatever that might mean, it should occur while there are still living eyewitnesses to the event. Well, it's difficult to interpret this, especially nearly 2,000 years later, but some equate the kingdom of God coming in power with the second coming of Christ, this being his first coming, and he'll die. But the second coming of Christ will bring Christ coming in power to establish the kingdom of God, and the rule of God manifests throughout humanity. Well, there's a problem about that. So far as we can tell, it hasn't occurred yet, and there are no more eyewitnesses left. So that makes it very difficult to interpret the passage that way, although others have no qualms about the survival or lack of survival of those eyewitnesses. Other interpreters try to explain the coming of Jesus in power with an event in Jesus' own lifetime. Some point to the passage that follows immediately after this passage, that is a passage that we call the Transfiguration, where Jesus is bodily transformed and he meets in the clouds on the mountain with Moses and Elijah and so forth. And some see that as Jesus coming in power. Others say that the resurrection is the point where Jesus comes in power. But all of these have strengths and weaknesses, and you'll find people arguing different positions on this particular passage. As we just noted, in chapter 9, we come to the passage that we call the Transfiguration. Here, Jesus goes for prayer. He takes his disciples partway up the mountain, and then he takes Peter, James, and John a little bit farther up the mountain, and then he goes a few feet beyond and prays, and his whole bodily form is transfigured, it's changed, it's altered. He becomes sort of this glowing figure, which brings to mind the glow that Moses' face, but not his whole body, had back in Exodus when he went up on the mountain of the Lord and interacted with him. But in this event, Jesus is seen talking with Moses and Elijah. You know, how they know this was a Moses and this Elijah. The text doesn't tell us. Maybe Jesus told the disciples later. But these two figures are widely assumed to be representative figures out of Jewish thinking. Moses was the human mediator between God and the people and providing a covenant for the people that had teachings and expectations about what God's going to do and expectations about what God's people are going to do. And you had all of this tied up in the Mosaic teachings, which in Jesus' day, at least by some individuals, Pharisees and others, included both a written portion that we refer to as the Pentateuch or the Torah or the books of the law, although there's very few laws actually there. Most of it's narrative, but sermons. But in any case, you have Moses representing that part of the Jewish heritage. Elijah, on the other hand, represents the prophetic tradition. And there's a strong prophetic tradition that oftentimes is dated back to Elijah, some dated back a little earlier, but Elijah surely represented the prophetic tradition. And a lot of the books of the Tanakh or the Old Testament are prophetic. Jews and Christians differ as to exactly what makes a book prophetic, but nonetheless, there's, in both cases, in both scenarios, a lot of prophetic material. And moreover, both Moses and Elijah had significant encounters with God on a mountaintop, on a mountainside, way up on a mountain. And both of them received commissionings, if you will. Remember in Exodus 3, Moses sees the burning bush. And out of that experience on the mountain, God commissions him to go to Egypt and demand of Pharaoh, "Let my people go." Elijah, on the other hand, had just really showed the awesome power of God on Mount Carmel when he had challenged the priest of Baal to a contest, and he won the contest head down, and Queen Jezebel threatened his life, and he goes running off and hides in the mountain. And God calls him out of that cave and commissions him, gives him a new task. So God may well be utilizing this event as a commissioning of Jesus in some sort. But in any case, you have this miraculous experience that Jesus undergoes here on the mountainside. Peter says to himself, I guess, something significant's happened here. Something really special has happened here. And Peter interprets this, I think, as the giving of a new law, a new Torah, a new covenant, and goes back to the old terminology, if you will, or terminology used to describe the events in the Jewish past. In the Jewish tradition still today, there is a feast called the Festival of Booths, and many Jews will build a little booth outside their homes, or sometimes within their homes, depending on where they are, and live in there during the days of the Festival of Booths as a way of reminding them that it was in the desert when the Israelites were at the bottom of Mount Sinai that God brought forth the covenant for the Jewish people and for God. And so when Peter says, let's build a booth, he is reflecting that idea that there's something new, there's something important here. He's not sure exactly what it is, probably, but he wants to memorialize it. And Jesus says, no, you didn't understand fully. So Peter has partial knowledge about this important event, but his knowledge isn't full. It's not complete. This story is also the second of the principal times in which we have the revelation that Jesus is the Son of God. At his baptism, Jesus, apparently alone in the Gospel of Mark, hears the voice of God when the heavens are ripped open, proclaiming him as the Son of God. And the account that we call the Transfiguration, we have the account of God speaking, and not only Jesus hears this time, but the three disciples, Peter, James, and John, also hear God's voice proclaiming, "This is my beloved Son. This is the Son I love." And so you have this idea that, the revelation of who Jesus is making some progress throughout society. You got direct word from God now to four different individuals: Jesus, Peter, James, and John. Direct word from God. And the disciples are told, listen to him. But don't tell anybody about this until after the resurrection. And so you have the account predicted here of the resurrection of Jesus. This is new information. They knew Jesus was going to die. That he's told them that. And now you have this story where God tells them that Jesus will be resurrected. Evidently, the disciples didn't really remember this, or their reactions at Jesus' crucifixion would probably not have been so extreme. But the texts tell us that the disciples remembered things that Jesus had told them after the resurrection. Well, when the disciples all come together with Jesus again, we have the account, the coming of Elijah. Elijah was interpreted to be the forerunner of the Messiah in various traditions among the Jews at the time of Jesus. The coming of Elijah is built on a couple passages out of the prophet Malachi. If you have the Protestant Old Testament, Malachi is the last book in the Protestant Old Testament because it prophesies the coming of Elijah, who in the Christian tradition is John the Baptist, and that John the Baptist precedes Jesus. And so you have that connection there. In the Catholic Old Testament, the arrangement is very different, and you have a number of other books that follow after Malachi. in the Catholic Old Testament. In the Jewish Tanakh, you have the work itself organized into three parts. You have the first 5 books called the Torah. Then you have 8 books as they're defined in the Jewish tradition of prophecy. And Malachi is in that section. But then there's a whole third section called the writings, which include Psalms and Proverbs and some other writings. But only in the Protestant Old Testament does Malachi end that testament, but then it leads into the New Testament. But Elijah is the key figure here, and it's only appropriate that Elijah have some sort of special role in the continuation of God's people. If you remember the story of Elijah, Elijah did not die an earthly death. He was translated, he was transferred from earth to heaven in a fiery chariot. And so he leaves this world in a great show of power and force, and he could come back because he hadn't died. Now, in Matthew, John the Baptist is explicitly tied in to Elijah and to the passage out of Malachi. In Mark, there is no exact tie-in between John the Baptizer and Elijah. Although most Christians, when they read, assume that Elijah is John the Baptist. Then we come to the story that Jesus heals a demon-possessed boy. This was a boy who would be taken over and have violent fits as a result of demon possession. Now, people are talking and speaking about Jesus, and the word gets back to Jesus and the disciples try to heal this young boy. Now, the disciples were called for 3 different reasons: to be with Jesus, to be sent out from Jesus, and to drive out evil spirits. It's this latter that's the focus of this account. The disciples know that they're supposed to drive out evil spirits, and they give it their best shot. They try, and finally they give up. They're unable to do that. And then Jesus is able to drive out that evil spirit. His statue as a holy man allowed him to do that. In the Jewish tradition, holy men received their power to do miracles. And Jesus wasn't the only Jewish miracle worker around at this time. But they received their power from God because they were in such close connection with Jesus. Their prayer life was so effective that they had special connections, if you will, with God. The disciples obviously didn't have that power. They didn't have that power to drive out at least these demons, but Jesus did. And Jesus responds to the disciples, this kind of demon takes much prayer. You need to be having a much better, much more substantial prayer life than what you've been having. There are some texts that also include the idea of fasting. This type of demon can only be driven out with much prayer and fasting. In the Jewish tradition, fasting and prayer were closely connected, but you didn't always have to fast in order to pray. But it was believed that certain times and in certain situations it was much more appropriate to fast and pray at the same time, and that would make your connections with God stronger. And then we get the perspective from another audience, if you will. We have the Jesus who all-knowing and seems to know where everything is going and giving passion predictions and so forth and so on. And you have the disciples who start out with a baseline. They know Jesus is the Messiah, and they're learning additional details about that as they go along. But now we have a perspective, if you will, from the audience, from those in the community. In this case, the father of the boy who was just healed. Jesus asked him, do you believe? And the man responds, I believe, help my unbelief. The man had partial faith, but sought assistance to obtain complete faith. Hey, I'm on the way, but I'm not there yet. Help me get there. And so you have this partial belief, this partial faith, but seeking additional faith, seeking additional belief. I believe, help my unbelief. We'll pick up here in our next segment, and we'll be looking at the second passion prediction and the third passion prediction and other materials as we end this passage we call Gaining Insight into who Jesus is and who the disciples are and who Christians should be. Thank you for your attention. God bless you.